open our envelopes. A moment of truth.
I really take them.
Oh no! Oh, my pens were behind. Oh, it's
Wait, 8 of the, okay, so we get a
okay.
2.
Let's.
Choose 8 of the 15 questions below to answer clearly as completely as possible in light.
Okay, so we're gonna start the timer for 15 minutes because I'm gonna be 15 minutes still go for it, right?
Great, yeah.
Okay. So we have 8 questions to choose. So everyone kind of look over.
Okay, these are interesting because they're not
They're not.
we have to use the books to be interpreted.
Right.
So, I want a pencil.
Okay, the thing is, Garber doesn't talk about compassion, community, and convictions. He talks about community, convictions, and something else. So that's like he
I
uses
could
a lot in
speak of
character.
compassion.
I know, but he talks about convictions, character, community, not compassion.
Well, maybe. Oh.
So what do I do?
I would just explain it and then.
Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, I'll good idea.
Okay, I can do number 9.
I can do 5. I'm gonna do 8 and 13 because those little ones with my names on it. I can do number 4.
I can do 15.
Let's do 2. Yeah.
Okay. Did someone do 2? By any chance?
Okay, so we're at 3 minutes. We're at 3 minutes.
We have 15 minutes to game. If we need left.
No, we have
only
3, like,
used it.
okay, we have a lot.
Oh. I'm gonna do 4 and 10. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do we want to just go in order of the questions? We can talk about that in a second. social science research, do you think that's anything with like theories or studies that study like kind of how people work and stuff together? I think it's kind of a combination of psychology and sociology.
Instead of 5, I'm gonna do 2.
So we have like 4
We
minutes.
should talk in like a minute to like order which ones we're gonna do. Convictions, I'm a little concerned because this says what does Garvin mean when he talks about compassion community, but the word he doesn't say compassion in the book. He says a different word.
I think it's just a typo.
I hope so.
You're probably fine.
Okay. So can we talk about questions really quick or not yet? Okay. Good.
Nathan did here. You could just have him go sit in on this.
That'll make me nervous.
It'd make me nervous.
You told me to watch the movie. We want you. Okay, we should talk really quick because we have a minute and 30 seconds. Okay, so who's doing what? Tell us what questions are you doing?
I'm gonna do numbers 4 and 10.
4 and 10. How about you, Kate?
2 and 15.
2 and 15. Laura? I know, but we have like
I'm doing 9 and 11.
9, 11, and I'm doing 8 and 13. Should we just go in order?
We can. I feel like that gives us a break. Like we all are pretty. Except for that's you starting and you finishing. Are you okay with that? I feel like that would probably just be easiest. That's nice. It literally goes every other except for yours. The same matching of all of us.
That's great.
All right. We still have a little time. Do we need to use it or are we ready?
We have 30 seconds. Okay. We can stop. 2.
Is it still going?
Okay.
The screen might glaze over and be my screensavers, but it's still going. Alright.
Okay, so we're going to start with number 2, which is, what is your philosophy of science for the psychology of religion?
Stopwatch so you know how long you've been talking.
Okay. So, in developing my own philosophy of science for the psychology of religion, first I think it was important for me to think about the tension between science and religion and how those affect the way that I view studying both of them. So in the study of psychology and religion and science and faith, it used to be implicitly believed that recognition of one truth violated the truth of another. So, for example, if someone had a conversion experience and then we found out later that it was just neurons firing off in the brain and there was a science behind it, people began to doubt God and would question, where does he fit in if we can just explain this away with science? So it was seen as a threat, but I personally don't think that it is a threat, and I think that it further explains spirituality and religion, and rather than explaining it away, it helps us understand it better, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can work together. So the psychologist Edwin Starbuck described science as conquering fields. So it was seen kind of like when science began to come into the study of religion, it was almost as if it had to conquer all the supernatural aspects of it, and it had to win and take over, and it was going to explain everything only with science. But that's not the case, I don't think. I think that both of them can be used simultaneously to help us better understand it all. So practically, that means that we can use scientific inquiry, we can use observation, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and we don't have to be afraid of using scientific processes or laws if we study religion, because we know that science is a gift that God has given us to study religion, and we don't have to be scared of that explaining anything away. Another aspect is that it's important to remember when studying religion that there's two different worlds of thought when we're studying science. One is behaviors that we observe, and one is abstract ideas. The problem with studying the psychology of religion is that much of a person's spiritual life is abstract concept and ideas. And you can't always see that clearly through the behavior, even though it seems like you should. So an example of this would be prayer. We study the observation of prayer. We study folded hands and the words that are said, but we can't measure quantitatively how someone is thinking and their motives in their heart, which is, I would say, like a huge aspect of religion. But Paluzian takes that into account and knows that when we're studying religion, especially with prayer, we are not observing the prayer, we are observing the behavior. And that's okay because it helps us further understand religion and the constructs that it has. But through everything, I think it's important to remember that God works through science and he works through religion supernaturally, and he can speak to us through both of them, and understanding science in no way detracts the validity of a religious perspective. What do you guys think?
We kind of, did any of you guys take neuroscience?
I remember I wrote a reflection about this.
So in neuroscience, we had to write a paper regarding like temporal lobe epilepsy, and like that was pretty much like science, like stuff happening in the brain was requiring individuals to have these super religious experiences like hallucinations or dreams or stuff like that. And pretty much what Dr. Struthers wanted us to think about is, does it seem unfair if God already programmed our brains to have these supernatural or religious experiences? Like, then are we actually making a choice? And I think it was just a really interesting conversation because it just got scientists and like people of faith talking. And there was people in, we read a book and a movie regarding it, who just like, some of them chose like to follow God after that experience, or others like they still were atheists, they still didn't care. But it was just having this contrast, like, so what if our brains are programmed to think of like God, and like what if, like, does that affect how you see God? And I just thought it was really interesting.
So kind of like with conversion and free will, it would be like God programs certain people to understand it, and we can learn that scientifically? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it was like people were having these experiences that were like they wouldn't be religious at all, and then they would have like a seizure, and then all of a sudden they were having these hallucinations and these dreams and these like super religious experiences, and just the idea of science and religion colliding, and like how does that affect us?
I guess when I think about that, because I was in that class actually with neuroscience. So, but the reason why they were having those like vivid experiences with God was as a result, was a result of a brain like lesion. So would that make that a religious experience if it was a direct result of it? Like, can those two things coexist? Of like, is it authentic religious experience as well as like it can be explained by science because there was a lesion in the brain, or a lesion is like like a cut or like some sort of injury towards like the brain that made them like, I think it put pressure on a certain like the temporal lobe that allowed them have these like vivid hallucinations. And specifically, it was a nun who felt already a religious person, felt very, very close to God because of these hallucinations. But then it was discovered like, okay, wait a second, it was because you have something wrong with your brain that you're having these. And so she had to ultimately make the choice, like,
Does she take?
Does she I think she can get treatment for it to like reduce the swelling and like which in turn like will take away the pressure on that side of the brain. So then she'll stop having those hallucinations. So she won't experience that closeness to God that she felt. And I still have problems thinking that's authentic. And I think that's something I struggle with is like I do keep them very polar almost between like science and religion. I use religion as a way of filling in the gaps where science can't explain things. They can't explain the supernatural, but they are like very much intertwined. They can coexist at the same time.
And that project, another account we had to look at was about a man who he wasn't religious, and he had a dream that he was the son of God. Do you remember that at all? And it was like and it wasn't just one, it was a few accounts, and he was having these strong experiences where it's like he knew that there was something there, and he couldn't quite, like it was like he was totally fine with getting treatment so he wouldn't have those hallucinations anymore, but he ended up like he didn't like the idea that if God was real, he was giving that to him in that way because he wanted to be much more of a choice. Yeah.
I feel like just to add, I think of my young life kids in this whole conversation of like science and religion, and they like a reason why they don't understand like how God works. I feel like it's because they want it to be like science. They want it to be like this formula of like you're good, God gives you gifts, and then your life is perfect, which I think is something that makes it hard with faith and religion. Is it's not this formula or like reason, but like faith is totally different than that. I think that's something that's been hard even for me in my life of like being a very analytical thinker, and so recognizing that science can't explain anything, and there are places in our faith that like won't be answered until the Lord comes again. So like how do we use like the strengths of both and kind of blend them together into this more holistic picture of like creation and how to love our neighbor and how our bodies work and how our bodies are made to be and stuff like that. That was just something that came to mind. Also, I had one other thought about this. If we took the 15 minutes in the beginning to go over stuff, so that means we won't have 15 minutes for each question.
Oh,
Does that make
capped
sense?
at 2 hours?
Yeah. So I feel like we should do like 10 minutes per question or like 11.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that either.
Okay. So, like as a closing thought, I think actually, no, never mind. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
All right. Okay. Next question is mine.
So
And it's go ahead. It's how do you plan to integrate your Christian worldview and lifestyle with the findings of good social science research? And I think really the first and like umbrella thing that comes to mind is just the way that our Christian worldview shapes how we see people. So in all types of research, whether that be chemistry, psychology of religion, whatever, that we see people, whether they're sick, whether they're healthy, no matter what state they're in, as being made in the image of God. And I think it shapes our research in that these people aren't projects or programs, but instead they are created in the image of God. So I feel like that is just kind of the umbrella thing. A few things that came to mind when thinking about research and integrating Christian worldview. First was conversion, and Lucian talks about 3 different types as being sudden, gradual, and religious socialization, and talks about research there of which type is going to last longest, or in like 50 years, if you talk to them again, still be a believer, as opposed to someone who might have had a sudden conversion and not be believing anymore, yada yada. And I think, again, conversion has been studied in a lot of different ways that show us which is most effective. But I think when we are able to integrate our Christian worldview, we again are able to see these people as people instead of as projects. Let's see. I'm gonna move on to talking about parenting. And there are a lot of different studies that talk about just research that talks about how can we as parents make sure that our children don't renounce the faith, or how do we make sure that our children, we like encourage them to make this their own, as Butman talks about, that faith has to be personal faith in order to last. And there was a study that Paluzian talks about where he said that there were 3 things that needed to be strong in the midst of a child's life that would ensure them that they would not renounce their faith. And he says the first, he was aware of, he knew the power of social influence and knew how to guard against it in the world. Second, he had prior information about the world and like the doctrine of other groups, so like cults that were trying to convince him otherwise. And then third, that he was able to retain a type of perceptual detachment, capacity for self-observation, which kept his own power to choose. So kind of that as we study kids and their ability to have parental faith as becoming their own, these 3 things that research talks about, and that integrating our Christian worldview very much shapes how we parent children and how we don't shelter them, but instead kind of expose them to the brokenness of the world, and therefore allow questioning to be something that's okay, and doubt to be something that's okay, and not encouraged, but like that it's like a continual conversation about these hard topics. So again, when we're looking at the social science research of parenting, I think integrating our worldview gives us a perspective of grace and of being okay with the questions and the hard things and the brokenness in a way that the world would not necessarily shed light on or try to avoid. And I think lastly, a piece of research that stood out to me was the attachment theory, and that the world kind of acknowledges that we were made to be attached to people, we were made to be in relationship, we were made to be known and to be loved, and that from a Christian worldview, we see this as being designed for a creator and designed to like be in right relationship with him, in right relationship with our families and parents, and I think it's cool that social science recognizes the attachment theory and that we have this perspective of knowing that we were meant to be with our creator. So it's just like another way that kind of like what Kate talked about, how the two fit perfectly together. So yeah, that was a little bit scatterbrained, but
So you mentioned the study and social influence. Can you talk a little bit more about social influence? What did you say about social influence?
with the parenting. Yeah, so Palutian talks about, he's talking about like, how do we teach children so that they will not be influenced by outside cults? That's kind of what he was talking about.
Okay.
So, like if a child has been raised in the faith and then all of a sudden is like exposed to some sort of gang, or I forget what he talked about specifically, like is kidnapped or physically mistreated. Like for example, how like Andrew Brunson was kidnapped and I'm sure they tortured him and tried to tell him to renounce his faith. So it was like the three things that research has shown to be beneficial to a student who's in that position, or a person who's in a position where those things that I mentioned.
It's interesting because I think about on like a lesser level, like not being tortured, but when parents decide like what education route they want to have for their kids, whether a Christian school or a public school, where like their beliefs would be challenged and like questions more so than in a Christian school. And I think that like is an interesting thought, because I feel like a lot of Christians would much rather put their kids in a Christian school because they have fears of their child being swayed into a direction, because like peer pressure and just like a lot of different values of the children in the school versus maybe a Christian school. But I feel like Palutian's almost saying the opposite, that maybe public school would allow their faith to be challenged more. But obviously there has to be like a secure attachment home, and then obviously like their parents' action like with faith, so they're hopefully secure in their own faith. I think that's like an interesting point.
Yeah, I think just going off of that, I think one thing that Palutian hit on a lot was the most secure faiths end up being the ones who are constantly questioning and growing and allowing themselves to doubt. And so, I mean, yeah, public schools would give that environment, but I think it's just kind of having the support, which parents would hopefully live on, be just where they do have that safety of, whether it be parents or teachers or mentors or someone, youth leaders, who they can like be like ask questions and be accepted that like, okay, you're doubting, that's all right, and just kind of foster that, and help them grow up in their faith, but also help them individualize it.
Yeah. What's that quote? Like a challenge, like an unchallenged faith is not. I don't know. It's
Challenged faith is a growing faith.
An untested faith is a brittle faith, and the first storms of life can result in shipwreck experiences.
And I think that's what happens a lot of times, where like maybe students who've grown up in such a Christian household and gone to like a Christian school, and then they get to university and there's just so many different opinions being thrown at them that it's like their faith hasn't been challenged. So then there's like almost like less of a foundation, and like seems like there's like a higher chance for them just to be plagued with like a lot of doubt, but maybe even like kind of lose their faith just based on all of that.
I think one last thing, I was looking at the but-isms that kind of combines the Christian worldview with like secular research. Is his quote says, "Our faithing commitments are complex interactions of biological, psychosocial, social, cultural, and spiritual factors." So again, that they're just both important to like what Kate talked about.
Good job, guys. Okay, so the next question is mine. So it's, what predicts long-term faithfulness according to Garber? So Garber, as you guys know, wrote The Fabric of Faithfulness, and it's all about like what keeps a person in the faith, especially like he focuses on college students. And 3 things that he mentions that predict long-term faithfulness is worldview and mentorship, and then also community. So one of his quotes is, "Worldviews do become ways of life, always and everywhere." So first, I think it's important to kind of define what a worldview is, but also know that it affects every thought, action, whether you know it or not. And there's a Chinese proverb that I thought was actually pretty good to describe a worldview, and it's like, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. So basically, water is the substance of the world in which the fish is immersed. So he's not even going to know that he's in water, just like we don't even sometimes know that we have these rose-colored glasses on in which we view the world. So the fish may not reflect on its own environment until suddenly it's thrust into dry land, where it struggles for life. Then it realizes that water does provide its sustenance. So immersed in our environment, we have failed to actually seriously take in maybe the ramifications of our worldview and how actually it is the way that we interpret so many things and the way we view things, and it's just is affected by culture as well as like our religion. So a personal worldview is a combination of what you believe is to be true and also is the driving force of everything that you do. So whether it's your emotions, your decisions, your actions, and even how you respond to different areas of life, even in like your theology and your anthropology classes, like your worldview will deeply affect how you interpret different events. So he specifically talks about students who have a coherent worldview, and how it's important because when it comes to faith, it allows the student to have their feet under them when talking about all sorts of issues and defending their faith. Instead of choosing between facts and values, the students must instead search for coherence in these messages across topics. This also includes recognizing that there's a higher power which binds all things together, and so having a coherent worldview essentially allows for them to tie in their beliefs, but as well as their actions. And in regards to faith, when you do connect your beliefs to actions, you develop a coherent narrative of the world, and it allows you to have like a stable base for when people do ask you questions and when people do challenge things. You are more stable in what you believe. And basically without having a coherent worldview, like the world doesn't really make any sense. So, and then here's a quote about, he also talked about ideas have legs. So like, there's always a connection between worldview and the way you live your life. Those two cannot not coexist together. And that also kind of when he talks about how ideas have ethical implications. So what you do, what you believe, what you think, your worldview, it doesn't just not affect people, it does. And then next, he talks about the importance of having a mentor. Basically, you can learn from people who have kept the faith longer than you have. A mentor is someone who is an example of living the tensions of the story, teaching us how to order priorities and contextualize information. It's someone that's been faithful in their walk, but is also someone we can look up to and discuss like difficult parts of faith and be honest with them, and hopefully they're honest with you. They're important because they embody the commitment and the values that you hopefully honor as well. And they're farther down the line of that faith that you can. It almost shows that a person like that can like be successful or like can live a life of like peace and hope. And I think also you can. The Bible, like we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses and the people that have come before us as well, and even characters in the Bible, people of faith, just like a life of joy and hope that they've lived. And so lastly, he also talks about community and how that is important in establishing a life of faithfulness. So according to Garber, here's a quote, is community is the context for the growth and convictions of character. So without community of people with common beliefs and lifestyles, a person can't really flourish and to become their own. We need people who walk alongside us, who strive to develop our coherent worldview, so that we can see connections between behaviors and thoughts, as we see like others living out their thoughts and behaviors. And also a healthy community is one that first and foremost is seeking God in every aspect of their life. When we seek God as the center of things, we place meaning, which are our beliefs, into action, and thus developing a coherent worldview with our Creator, which unites all. a healthy community also depends on grace, which then allows us for community to make mistakes and then challenges beliefs, and also ultimately allows us to grow. Garber says that every good life is essentially a story of grace, and every healthy community, grace must be prevalent because the path to a coherent narrative is also a journey and it's not automatic. A healthy community is also one that encourages the development and praxis of Christian worldview. It's kind of almost like peer pressure, but peer pressure towards good things, hopefully. So that is what I have about what Garber believes promotes a life of religious commitment.
It's interesting thinking of that, and then also like how do you parent, and how do we like we were talking in our human development and ministry class today of like how do we learn how to parent our kids well, and like talking about what Butman talked about of how do we give them this foundation but also allow them to be exposed to the brokenness of the world. And even within our communities, there are people, I mean, we all are sinners and we're all affected by sin. So how do we kind of encourage that environment as a parent and when we have kids? And just the balance of like teaching them and just like kind of correcting them in disobedience, but also allowing them to kind of learn for themselves and be in community with other believers and other non-believers. Just sounds tricky.
And you talked about mentorship, like parenting is a really unique kind of mentorship. That's really hard because it requires a lot of vulnerability on the children's side and the parents. And so I think achieving mentorship in a parent-child relationship is really, really cool. And I feel like Garber would encourage, but practically I feel like it would be really hard. And I'm not sure how to do it well.
And also is like a sort of mentorship is like as a parent, like your behavior as well at home.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that scares me because it's like you're just like he's like your thoughts and you must match like your actions and like what you speak as like to your child and what you find is important in your faith. Hopefully they match, and I think that is something that can be challenging. And children are always watching.
Even when he talks about his grandchildren all the time, how he's like super intentional when he thinks about that
Yeah.
because they observe and
It's integrity. You want them to follow your lead if they're going to act in accordance with how they think. They're going to notice that.
I think this class has made me terrified to be a parent because it's something that I want so badly, but it's also something that I'm scared to do because what does affect them most is like if their parents are doing what they say or if they're like acting the way they're supposed to for what they believe. Yeah. And I think that like for me it is very easy to see my parents' faults, and I think they're amazing. They're absolutely amazing. But just knowing that like one day the possibility of like children looking up to me and that having a strong effect on the way they see God or they view the world, that's pretty powerful.
we were talking today in a class that Kate and I read. I feel like a lot of the time we think about like parents need to be examples for their children, but also we were talking about how the church needs children, like adults need children, and children need like elderly people, and elderly people need children, and so just as like parents are important for mentoring children, like the body of Christ is beautiful because it has so many different parts, and that the children are equally as important in like teaching us and their parents, and which I think is something the church neglects often.
I think it also is like a healthy balance of because talking about those three things, like the isolation, like three things that will like are a prediction of like falling away from the faith. What is it like? It's like isolation, pride, and lack of self-esteem. No,
Self-compassion.
self-compassion. And I think about parents who in my church, I feel like I always viewed them as like, because I feel like my parents were always the kind of parents who like sometimes we didn't go to church and like sometimes they were like looked down upon. But then I see like the parents who I thought were like they were super strict and super like always went to church. So almost got a little bit legalistic, and I think about how there's like kind of a healthy balance of that, or and it ended up like those were the children who like ended up falling away from the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And like, but then I think that led to those children not having a good self-esteem of themselves because they were always told like, nope, don't do that. Like
You're bad.
yeah, you're being selfish. You don't have low self-esteem. Like that doesn't exist. You're just being prideful. It's not like humans love themselves enough. And I think I just think that's like super interesting after taking this class and now like reflecting on that and thinking about why people did fall away from the faith. So I think there is just like a super high correlation between lack of self-esteem, and I think a lot of times, I know this is a little bit off topic, a lot of times people I think are so worried about their children being prideful that they don't like encourage them, and they almost like only discipline, and there's like a lack of love there, just based on like wanting to be a good Christian parent and wanting them to do all the right things, but then it leads to just like poor self-esteem. And I think a lot of times it's opposite. They're not going to have like a lot of pride. They're going to actually just be think very low of themselves, even though they're image bearers as well, and they are children of God, and like they are worthy. Still going here.
We're going?
Yeah. Good.
All right, well, that actually ties in very well to my next question. Sorry, Kate. Of how can parents...
We're on a talk show.
I know, right? That's really good. How can parents and teachers develop a healthy sense of self in their children and adolescents? And I think we've actually touched on a lot of this, but I think that's because parenting is important to us. Kaufman talks about this like right away in chapter number 5, and he says perhaps one of the most priceless gifts a parent can give to their children is an appropriate sense of self-worth. And I think that that is just so true, and I like a lot of that comes into what you were saying of parents and teachers are reserved in their compliments. And so in this chapter, he gives some facts just off of like in like babies, how often they're receiving negative feedback versus positive feedback. And 83% of 83% of kids who are receiving consistent negative language have low self-esteem, and then 60% of children who just have one parent giving significant like negative feedback have low self-esteem. And then it talked about how like in even just the first like year or two of your existence that like most of the language that babies are receiving are like, no, don't do that, or hey, stop, or just because it's like we want to protect them, but in that they're receiving so much negative, and they have this idea of like, oh, I'm doing so much wrong. And the percentages were from 10 to 17 months, 54% of the feedback that babies are receiving is negative. And I think it just goes to show that, it's really sad. I think it goes to show that we want the best for kids. Like we want safety, but in that they are attaching to something which isn't secure. And it's pretty much the development of secure attachment and knowing that you were so loved and you were so valuable within your parents' like perception of you. And I think one way that parents and teachers can work on that, just not through imagery as they're growing up, is like empowering them in something they're good at,
or making sure to be extremely encouraging, because we're such a society that is like goal oriented. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, like, but you want good grades, or you want to be achieving something achievement based. Like we are, like that is our focus. And so when a child feels like they're failing to achieve, I think it just kind of takes a hit on their self esteem, and it's so rampant in like in our communities, and I think that it just needs to be made aware of. And I think some practical things are just like being encouraging when your child doesn't do well. Like I think personally myself, like if I had a bad basketball game, my parents were not about to encourage me. I was going to hear about everything I did wrong the whole basketball game. And I don't look at my own life and go, oh yeah, that really took a big hit on me. But I can see how things build up. And over time, those things are really hurtful. And I could have gone, well, my parents are disappointed in me because I didn't play well today. But then another thing talked about are different views of parenting. And there was the permissive parent, and the authoritarian parent, and the authoritative parent. And I think this would apply to teachers as well, where the permissive parent is one with little authority. They're warm, and they're pretty flexible, but they don't really maintain much. Like if their kid did something, they wouldn't punish them for anything, or they wouldn't really, they're just permissive. They just scratch it. And the authoritarian is firm rules, and if obedience isn't like followed, they're definitely going to get punished for it, and it's just like it's pretty strict. And then the authoritative parents are parents who have clear and firm expectation, but they have grace and they're flexible when that doesn't happen. And that's something we spoke a lot in developmental psychology, of just you want to be a parent who has clear expectations, but when those expectations aren't met, there's a significant amount of grace given, just because it's like we're human, we're bound to consistently mess up, and we're sinful. And so the way that we kind of speak to one another or criticize one another just needs to be so significantly wrapped in love. And I remember that one thing Dr. Buttman said was everything should be sandwiched. So it was like significantly more positive language than negative language, and just being aware that like there is freedom to fail.
I think like this reminds me also of like Erickson's stages of development, and thinking about well, the first one is like it has to do with like infants and trust versus mistrust, and like that has a lot to do with like the parents and the like a loving response to the child. And then I also think about like there's autonomy versus shame, which is the next, and like you're supposed to allow like a room for like failures.
We all had those
theories
pulled up.
Oh really? Yeah, I mean, because it just applies so like directly, and like and well, and then I think of the next stage where it's like initiation versus guilt, and like allowing a child to feel a sense of like they can like do stuff and they have the ability, and like I think that also then when talking about teachers of like giving out compliments, and then a girl in my class actually gave a story about how every single time she left the class, the teacher would say like, Alexandra, you're such a great writer. Do you know that? You're such a wonderful writer. And maybe that wasn't true, or maybe she was just an average writer, but like she said like she has carried that sense of like, oh, I have the ability to like write, and like she said then that like allowed her to like raise her hand and like write on the board, because she felt that sense of like accomplishment and like security in herself because of just that simple like, you're such a great writer. And it just makes me think like how much of an effect you can have on a child, and how that will lead into like later stages of development and whether a child even is like a leader, whether like a follower, because during this stage they didn't feel like they had the ability to like lead activity.
It just builds.
It does. It truly does.
I think something I noticed a lot in parenting that can cause shame is when parents don't allow their children to explore and kind of, we talked about the language in the first few years of life is always, no, put that down, don't do that. And it's always because we want to protect children and want to keep them safe. But in that, I don't know, like whenever I babysit, I always, because you can see the kids doing stuff and you're like, well, that's annoying and I shouldn't do that. Oh, that's like not appropriate, whatever. I started being like, unless it's dangerous to someone, I'm not going to tell them to stop because they need to explore the world. And because otherwise, I would tell a kid I was babysitting to stop, and they would just get like shame would just cover their face, and they would never do it again. And it's so important, unless it's going to harm them, for them to explore the world and try and fall, and you know, and see, hey, that didn't work, this worked, and how does that relate to my faith and things that I can explore and questions I can ask. And
I feel like when I hear all of this, it makes me think like, how on earth am I gonna be a parent and like give the perfect balance of like teaching my children, but also letting them explore, and even with what we were talking about earlier with like worldview formation of like there's so many things in schools and like on social media that will be trying to pull for their attention, and all of these like broken things that sin has tainted that were meant to be good things. And I think it's comforting to know that, this sounds cheesy, but that like the Lord has them in their hands, and that like I can do all that I can to like help them successfully go through, for example, Erickson's stages, that like ultimately they are secure, and like, yeah, but it is a little bit overwhelming to think about.
Something that this touches on, but it's controversial, was discipline in this, and how, because like good parenting and just loving, like we do need to be critiqued or criticized sometimes, and it's healthy, like even it's biblical, and just the idea of what does healthy, loving discipline look like. And there was a big debate about spanking versus non-spanking. And
How many of you were spanked?
I was spanked in the belt, in the spoon.
I was spanked. Were you spanked?
I was spanked like twice. I was a very mild kid.
I was a bad kid. But it was interesting, just the idea of what that can do to your secure attachment, or just the constant feel of like shame or indifference. And really the idea is that shouldn't be like a first resort, and that shouldn't be something that is like taken lightly at all. And there are ways to correct things that don't involve like physical punishment. Like priorities could be taken away or something like that. But it was just interesting, the idea of like how does discipline affect one's sense of self-esteem, and like it's so important, but also how do we do that with like children's self-esteem in mind. Also, just one last thought was the do as you say, not as you do idea of parenting. One way I think to best like promote self-esteem in your child is to exemplify healthy self-esteem. And I think that just like that would be shown in the way you choose to talk about yourself. So just modeling that well.
That makes me think automatically of like body issues. And I remember I had a friend in high school who would just always talk so poorly about her body. Like she'd look in the mirror and just like rip herself to shreds. And I remember I went over to her house for the first time, and then I heard her mom speak about her body. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. It's just such a learned behavior. I think that can apply to a multitude of things, not just like body image, but something to think about.
So interesting. And that touches on to like how media could affect one's self-esteem, and that that is something that parents and teachers should be aware of as well, because it's that is largely affecting children and adolescents today, and what's on social media or even what's seen on television.
Which I feel like that factor is scary, because then it's you can do all you can as a parent, and yet there's so many other factors pulling your children away. So it forces you to kind of relinquish it into the Lord's hands and be like,
Yeah, I'm so scared of how sexualized girls are now, and we were talking about in human sexuality. You can't even go to the makeup aisle without makeup being the title of it being so sexual, and then that starts conversations prematurely that don't need to happen. Yeah, it's okay.
But yeah, I think it just is it's scary how much a child's sense of self-esteem can be affected, and it almost seems like the world is working against us, and it's something that we know we need to work towards, but there's just some kind of gap there that it's we're trying, but it doesn't seem to be going well.
okay. I think I might be next.
Number 11?
10.
10. You're 10.
Oh, yep, I'm 10. Okay.
Good.
So the question is, how would you compare and contrast an intrinsic committed versus extrinsic consensual style of faith? So I'm going to first start out with defining these so we're all on the same page. And according to Paluzian in chapter 8, so these are basically two different motivations of what's motivating us to go to church or have faith, etc. So first, intrinsic is the reasons for inner faith lie within rather than outside the person. So for example, faith is the master motive for actions in someone's life, and religion affects all areas of someone's life, not just church. So that being the way that faith has affected our lives. We've chosen to go to Wheaton and continue to invest ourselves in various ministries, or so intrinsically faith has kind of transformed the way that we spend our time, etc. And then the second being extrinsic, which Paluzian says tend to use it for our own self-interest, payoff, or gain, tangible reinforcement for their own ends. So, for example, someone going to church, or their only religious thing being going to church because that's they want people to see them there. And just kind of some background, Paluzian talked a lot about different studies where they tried to compare these two and tried to figure out if different motivations predicted long-term spiritual growth or spiritual commitment. And he found that, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but that people who had the intrinsic motivation of participating in various ministries or faith-based activities, not for what other people would see them as, but for a way that the Holy Spirit had transformed their lives, was more fulfilling and obviously more meaningful. And this made me think sort of again of conversion. And do you guys remember when we watched that video of conversion in India, you guys in class, and how it was so forced, and we are white, we're coming over here and forcing you for our own gain and for our own benefit, and just with the failed promises, the bribes, and that totally being an example of this extrinsic motivation of these are our projects and we're going to try to convert them for numbers, or because we're right, we're dominating or whatever. And I think of leading Young Life too, and oftentimes we try to see our kids as our project instead of being children of God who we get to be in relationship with. So I think
a big difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is the way that we've let our beliefs transform our lives, and if that really comes from like a genuine, honest desire to like know and love Jesus and love the ways that he loved and kind of let that transform the way that we love. And I think another thing is looking at the example of Jesus Christ and how like we are called to serve. And I think there was a video that Dr. Buttman showed about the Good Samaritan. Was that in class? That might have been reading. But just like thinking of the picture of Jesus again and how he did nothing to toot his own horn. And even the verse in the Bible that says don't pray like on the street corner for everyone to see. And I think it challenges me to think of like, what are the ways that I am extrinsically motivated, or like even the pressure at Wheaton to be involved in everything and get good grades and get the best job, of like what really matters in this life that's so temporary and so short, and just sometimes convicting in the ways that I approach my day-to-day life, or the reason I interact with people, or again like the things that I take part in. Let's see. Kind of finishing up. Pelusian talked a lot about different research studies, which I won't really go into, but he said that when looking at like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, the most important thing was this idea of quest, and that we all like are looking for something. So it's like, how are we going to get there? Because we all have a hole missing within us. So like, how are we motivated to kind of figure that out? And there was a question actually in the like study guide thing that said, how might the quest orientation be a useful supplement instead of looking at this like intrinsic versus extrinsic, and instead looking at it as a quest? And there's a quote that said, in which religion is an open-ended process of pursuing ultimate questions more than ultimate answers, and designed to measure an approach that involves honestly facing existential questions in all their complexity while at the same time resisting clear-cut pat answers. So while like talking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation can be important, I think ultimately it's about this idea of a quest and how we all desire to find answers to questions, but interesting that it said pursuing ultimate questions more than ultimate answers. Yeah, it's a little bit scatterbrained, but
I think it's interesting what you said about it being about the quest and the questions and not the answers, and the different levels of spiritual maturity and religious commitment. That like when I was first becoming a Christian in high school and I had all these big questions that caused me to doubt the faith, and I think a good way that helped me to grow, I would look at my mom, and the way she approaches existential questions is just like this faith of, I don't need to know the answer. Like, I believe in God, and I know that he loves me, and I trust him, and I don't need to know how this works or that works. I just know that he is, and he loves me. And like, my level of faith is like, yeah, but in order for me to believe that and to commit to that, I first have to ask all these questions and like be in pursuit of this quest to ask the right questions and find the answers. And so it's interesting how like a quest for the answers and the questions can relate to spiritual maturity. And I think both of them offer differing values. Like, they're both good, I think. I don't think just searching for answers is better or worse than just asking questions.
I think there's an importance of the like balance of
Yeah, because there's a lot of questions we won't ever know the answer to, but the character that comes from asking them, I think, is worth it.
I think I verge on the side of almost too extrinsic, where I'm like your mom, where it's like, I don't need to know the answer, but specifically this last summer, I feel like just the people I was surrounded by, the stuff that I didn't need to know the answer was important to them, and I was kind of like, I was probably the one who was pursuing, or who has consistently pursued faith the most, and so they were asking me these questions, and where I have been comfortable in saying, I don't know, and I'm okay with it. I then had to like wrestle with, so that I could dialogue with them, and it was just interesting because it really is important just to have a balance of both. And like you said, like both show a maturity in the faith and have like equal value of importance. It really is interesting because I feel like if you didn't have like faith in Jesus, then it's like, why would you have intrinsic motivation? Because I feel like the world is all about extrinsic, like get the bigger job, get the bigger paycheck, like prove that you can do it, show fame, be like glitzy, glam, whatever. So it's like, it makes sense as to why that is such a motivation in the world. It's like there is nothing deeper to kind of pursue and wrestle with, like you said. All right, are we ready to move on? Okay, 3 more, right? Yeah, we're doing great. Is it still going? Do we want to check it?
Yep.
We started at 10. We've been going for an hour 13.
Woohoo! All right, so the next question is, I just hit everything, is what strategies would you employ to promote more loving beliefs and behaviors towards others? This is like, you guys are going to have to help me not preach because this is something I'm so passionate about. I think this, like, first and foremost, comes from knowing that you are fully loved by God. And so if you have that security, you're going to be able to demonstrate it to others. But it's also, like, having that security is also learning what it looks like to love yourself. And there's so many things that tie into this. But one thing I think that this has been exemplified for me in loving beliefs and behaviors by pretty perfectly is I work with Young Life Capernaum, which is Young Life with for people who have special needs. And in this community, they just love so generously, and they don't have the idea of like social barriers, and so they really just almost give themselves fully. And it scares me because I go, protect yourselves, like these people, you can't, like, they're not always going to be there. And as a society, we are just catered to have these ideas of protection, and like, but these students have just, as a leader, they have taught me what it looks like to love well because they love me so generously and almost like without like bounds. And it's so interesting because I see importance in protected love and not just giving yourself to everyone you encounter. But then when I look at the life of Jesus, I think he calls us to love in a risky way. And if you watch him, he loves in a way that is so, like, he doesn't protect himself. It's completely selfless. And so just the idea of that ties into Kaufman's chapter on love and empathy and altruism. How do you say that word?
Altruism.
I always mess it up. I don't think there's an S in it. There's not altruism. But when I first read that, I started it and I seriously read the title and I was like, I think that love is empathy and altruism. Like, I think those are large components. But he kind of broke it down from a psychological perspective. But I think one of the biggest things is just recognizing the humanity of others and being willing to let people fail. And then Steinberg's model of love, it's a triangle. I don't know if you guys remember this. And there's intimacy, passion, and commitment. And like there's several different kinds of love that have one of those things or two of those things. But the goal of like perfect love is to have all three of those things: intimacy, passion, and commitment. And I think that like when we do that, I think one thing we struggle with is commitment in love. I think we get so scared of like being hurt ourselves, so we reserve ourselves a little bit. And I think I don't know. I just really have been thinking so much of what it looks like to love generously, and are we called to love in a way that we protect ourselves, or are we called to love so freely? And he touches on taking on the shoes of a child and taking on the shoes of a servant. And the idea of shoes in his child is just seeing the best in every human and being and recognizing their inherent dignity and self-worth. And I think that's what my Capernaum students do very well, is they see me and they just admire me so much. And it almost hurts me because I know I don't give them enough, and I don't like, but I show up and they love me for who I am, and it's like that is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing for them. And then developing the shoes of a servant is just the willingness to sacrifice for others and doing acts of service that will come at one's expense. And I think as college students, especially the last 4 years, we've had to have like a strict schedule, and we've had to kind of like have our priorities in order so that we get like everything done. And I think in that, for me personally, it's been easy to lose sight of selflessness and sacrifice for others, because it's like, oh, I would love to help you, but like I have this really important exam I need to study for, and it's like that is important, but like also we need to be willing to sacrifice for one another, and it's so hard to be able to make sacrifices. But there's that one quote that says, like, you will know. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Like, you will know the love of a Christian by how busy he is, or something like that, or how. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a Buckman.
But we talked about like busyness is like what robs you of like like even like the Good Samaritan, and like it robs you of noticing, and it robs you of like caring
and so just the idea of being so willing to serve one another, and it just goes against like our nature, like that's not our desire at all. But just like I think the knowledge of how loved you are by God, and then looking at the life of Jesus and just seeing how he loves. I didn't even give practical steps, but I think it's just like availability.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're so ingrained, especially in this society, especially in college, to be busy. To like almost busyness like defines success. Like, oh, I'm in this group and I'm in this group and I'm doing this, and I'm taking this many credits, and like, but then that does like rob us from like loving people well. And then also when I think about loving people well, I think of when you see every person, think about they are created in the image of God, and like if we all actually truly kept that in mind, like how that would just change so many things. How dare you like gossip against someone who's like in his image, and like I also think about a book. I was an RA last year, and we had to take a class with Barrett McRae, and he assigned a book called Compassion by Henry Nouwen. And I think about a lot of times people will talk about it's scary almost to be loved by someone, because there's that quote by Tim Keller, is like to be loved and like not known is like superficial and it may feel nice, but then to be known and then not loved is like our worst fear. But I think about the opposite as well, as like it is scary for someone who's loving someone to be vulnerable with them and to just sit in that vulnerability, and sometimes just to sit in silence with someone and like just be there is also like a sacrifice and also like terrifying. I think that's always stuck with me because sometimes like you don't have the words to say and you don't know how to love someone well, but I think it's like the act of just being there. And that also like relates back to like busyness. Like we can't be there for someone if we're so wrapped up and our mind is always going to somewhere else. So when someone needs you, just sit there and just be. And like maybe even just like hold their hand. If you don't have the words to say, it means more of just being there. And I think about Dr. Butman brought up that maybe it wasn't talked about. No, it was during chapel. The speaker about how his friend was in the hospital and he's like, I just didn't know what the words to say, but I just stood there and held his hand, and then he started crying and said just like thank you. And I thought that was really moving as well.
I have a couple of quotes written down from that chapter, which I don't know why, but one says, Jesus' definition of a neighbor is thus linked not to religious office or title, but to empathy, which leads to compassionate action. Empathy's most critical role may be a stimulus to loving action. So again, just like the perfect example. And then I think in that same chapter it talks about 8 types of love common. And so he like names all these loves like empty, romantic, compassionate, famous, yada yada. And then he said the one that's missing is the selfish nature that Christians associate with agape love. So that this like agape love of Jesus like isn't even something that we can comprehend or like put words to, but that it's so like all encompassing, and this is like the love that we're freely given and the love that we're called to of like loving our enemies, and it's just like so radical.
The last sentence of my reflection paper on this chapter was, I've realized that loving your neighbor takes courage and a willingness to fail, but it also requires a heart of resilience, of constantly seeking to love well. And I think just the idea that it's like, it is something that like we need to be comfortable that we're not always going to love well, but it's something that we need to keep pursuing, like, and consciously, how am I going to love my roommates well today? How am I going to love my friends well today? How am I going to love this stranger I pass on the street? Like, it's such a big thing, and it's so hard to do well, but it's something that, like, I feel like we need to keep aiming to do well, because it's easy to just rest in the fact that, like, the Holy Spirit is in us and, like, He'll guide us, but it's like we need to be prompting ourselves. We're called to obedience and loving generously.
A practical stuff that I'm trying to work on, that I learned about in my philosophy class, is presupposing love in other people. So if you look at someone and you don't presuppose that love lives inside them, or that they are loved, or that there is love, and that they might not love you, then it's going to be really hard to love them. And so I'm trying to look at the people that I don't naturally presuppose love in and say, the Creator who loves me loves them just as much, and because love lives inside them, they are capable of love, and I am called to love them. That's really love
And
presuppose love.
I think something that has helped me as well, and like a something that I've employed, like a strategy to promote loving beliefs about people, is like praying for them. Like people that I've like struggled with in the past, or maybe who have like hurt me. Praying for them, it's just like, it's really hard to hate someone who you're praying for. And it's something that I heard a message in high school, and like I've done it ever since, and like it has really helped me change my view of a lot of people. And I think it's something that a strategy like a lot of people should employ. It's good. It's hard, but it's good.
Try this again. Are you ready?
Okay. So the next question is, what does Garber mean when he talks about compassion, community, and conviction? The thing is, those are not the three words that are in the book. But compassion is probably definitely like a component, but he used the words conviction, character, and community. And this is like specifically talking about people that they looked at who are college students who are now like far into adulthood, who have like remained faithful, and like the three strands or like the three behaviors that allowed them, that is like common amongst all of them, that promoted a sense of faithfulness. So but first, like when we talk about like Garber's like view for like religious development, like hopefully we come to the understanding like you'll eventually come to your understanding of like the place of your place in the world. It's like you develop like a healthy worldview, or a coherent worldview rather, and like mentorship and community. And of course, like it's a lifelong journey, and like as we go through life, like different things happen, and then like we need to learn how to incorporate them into the context of serving our God. And so, but the question is like, but why do we care about having purpose in the world aside from like the fact that it gives life meaning? And I was reading, and it's making sense about life gives us opportunity to see life from God's perspective. It gives us a story of grace, which Garber talks about, to everything we do. And the way we think about life affects how we live life. And if we only think about ourselves, such as how successful like our career will be, how much money we'll make, we'll never be aware of like our place in the story that God is like weaving for us and like through the universe. And we care about coherent worldview, connecting what we know to what we do, because we are created to bring and allow God's kingdom into everything we are part of. And so in this, we are convinced that concerning the hurts, like the pain, the evil in the world, and we have responsibility to let light shine through us to show compassion. So that is the word he used, compassion. So to show compassion even when we perceive maybe the worst of mankind. We should seek people to fully know them and know their story like Jesus does. And I think of examples that I think Batman was talking about a man who just pursued everyone and genuinely just wanted to know them just like Jesus did. So when we take God's gifts and we hide them away, like only ever getting poured into, we ignore the calling Jesus has placed in our lives. As Christians, we must pour out and must allow behaviors to reflect our beliefs. And do so, we are guided by our community and mentors to be able to do that. But furthermore, concerning those three factors that were mentioned, convictions, which convictions are basically, they were taught a worldview. So this is talking about the people that they followed throughout the book who were faithful past like college. And they were taught a worldview which was sufficient for the questions and the crises of the next 20 years, particularly the challenge of modern postmodern consciousness with its implicit secularization and pluralization. So concerning like convictions, what we believe gives meaning for our existence and provides a anchor in a world of multiple conflicting beliefs. I think it's like hard when we're in a society that is like basically promoting that truth is relative, and it basically gives like direction to our life. So for students to live consistently as a Christian, we must like must be convinced that our truth is actual like capital T truth, that it is the only objective truth. And the next is character. So they said that they met a teacher who incarnated the worldview which they were coming to consciously identify as their own, and through that relationship, they saw that it was possible to reside within that worldview themselves, and that's character. So convictions grounded in reality are significant for the way we live, but convictions alone are not enough in the Christian life. They need to be matched by character that is worthy of the one who redeemed us and the one who represents us on earth. And lastly is community. So they made choices over the years to live out their worldview in the company of mutually committed folk who provided a network of stimulation and support, which showed that the ideas could be coherent across their whole life. And Garber notes, and he quotes, that community is the context for the growth of convictions and character, what we believe about life and the world, becomes plausible as we see it lived out all around us. This is not an abstraction, though. It really is seen in time and space, in the histories and circumstances of real people living real lives. So working together with other believers allows us to make mistakes and then show grace to one another and learn from one another. So overall, conviction, character, community are three major ingredients for a life of meaningful service towards the kingdom. And another quote is, woven together, convictions, character, and community nourish a vision of moral meaning which can stand against the most destructive forces of the contemporary world.
That's a good word.
That made me think of identity formation and Erickson's sages, and I don't know which one it is that's like identity versus
Identity versus role.
yeah, identity versus role confusion. And I feel like if those three things are not present like throughout the lifespan, and if they don't carry you through each developmental stage and transition in life, then it's going to be really hard to keep your morals if you can't keep who you are. So, yeah, that if those three things are solid and your identity is solid, moving roles in life, whether that be like graduating or a new job or just coming to college, all those transitions, if you're rooted in community and character and conviction and you surround yourself with those things, you're not going to be confused about your role, regardless of how externally that role might change.
And I think like that makes me think about like college and how important it is then like during that time, during like the identity versus role fusion, to like really like cement in like your worldview, because it shows like even by like example, like it will carry you through, but I think it's so important during that like formative time to have that. And then also like community, of course, is super important, and having good character as well. But that's a really good point. It does fit in pretty well with Erickson's stages. And I know identity versus role confusion is supposed to be like, it's like 12 to 18, but since like things have changed, like school's longer now, it extends into like college, so it does actually fit pretty well.
Those three things make you think of like ideally like what the church is supposed to be, of like conviction in our sin, community, and building character and like Christ like minded people. So like I don't know, it makes me sort of sad of like the ways that the church is broken and that we were broken, and how like it was designed to be that way, and like I mean every church has failed in some manner, but it's kind of cool that that is like the responsibility as us as believers living in a community to like confront each other when we see patterns of sin manifesting themselves in our lives, and to like challenge each other in godly character and like this agape love that we were talking about earlier, like in community. And that's why we were made for community and why we were given each other like in the body of Christ. That's just cool.
I think it's interesting because it's pretty countercultural to like the millennial idea of like, okay, you can believe that, but I believe this, and like let's still function. And it's like sometimes that does seem loving, sometimes that does seem like important, but also just like accountability is significantly important too. And so it just kind of it stares that in the face, and it doesn't really give us an excuse. It's like what you're talking about like capital T truth, of like in some areas it's good to hear each other out, but there are things that are definitive.
And it is hard. It's like so hard in this culture because you really don't want to be perceived as like judgmental, and you want to be accepting. And like we are in a culture where it's like acceptance is like everything, and like it almost like somehow has become not accepting, almost in a weird way. But I feel like once you become that, and like you just like you let yourself like kind of fall any which way, and like you lose yourself, and like then you're not grounded. But it is really, really hard because you want to be accepting, and it's something that our culture is just like really, really, really pushing. And I think there is like acceptance is a like something that should be valued, but to like an extent, of course, and you don't want to accept like a harmful behavior or like, oh, that's for you, but that's not for me. It's like no.
Even thinking of like the community piece is like our culture is so focused on like being an individual and being independent. And it's funny because like the attachment theory, like we were made to be dependent on something. We were made to be in relationship with something, and that being God. And so it's funny that we've gotten so far off that, and like we were designed for community, but yet like we hold independence and like individualism so highly. Not that those are bad things, but it's like dependence is such like it's such weakness. But like we were created for dependence, which is ironic.
Last question. Woohoo! The last one is
Please, we go. It is because the green lights on.
Oh yeah.
woohoo! Question 15.
We're doing good on time too.
What appears to be some of the factors that prompt religious beliefs and behaviors? So Paluzian describes 4 specific prompts for religious development in chapter 5. So I'm just going to go through and quickly explain them. I think it's interesting because all of these can work together, and there can even be paradoxes within these factors and conflicting things within these factors. So the first one is paradoxes that adolescents, in particular, the adolescents in particular deal with is that need to want to be want to be independent, but we are still dependent, and that's really confusing because when we approach religious development, we want that culture of individualization and wanting to be our own thing, but then all of a sudden we're like, wait, we do need people, and I am not entirely dependent as I want to be. So that paradox can either lead someone to more boldly accept religion and to really dive into that, or to back away and say, this doesn't make sense, it's not for me. So the second one is cognitive factors that can prompt religious development. Pretty self-explanatory. Basically, we talked a lot about Erikson, the psychosocial stages of development, that at each stage there's different cognitive abilities that we have, and that affects how we understand ourselves and how we understand God, and how we're going to accept religion based on how we view it and conceptualize it, and if that's abstract or if it's concrete. So once we kind of move through adolescence, that's when we start being able to embrace and conceptualize abstract thoughts and formal operational thought, making it possible to lean toward ideas like theology. But if those ideas are presented too strongly before that cognitive ability, it can make someone push religion away and away from developing. The third factor is social factors. Such as the family and the church. There are two main factors that mold someone either towards or away from religion. And a lot of times behavior regulation is based heavily on social comparison too. So if someone sees people around them, say in the context of Wheaton, they see people always going to chapel and always praying, then that religion can have a social impact on them of either pushing them towards that or away from that. And I think that can ebb and flow in development too. We talked a lot about parenting and how that can encourage or even coerce people into religion based on a certain set of standards that people have to obey to when they're growing up. we talked a lot about schooling, Christian versus public. I think the danger with this social factor is that, at least for me, growing up in a Christian school, a lot of parents kind of defaulted as the school became the church, and so their home life and their church life became lazy. So like, my parents did a great job, but I never went to youth group, and I wasn't involved in my church, and most of my Bible teaching came from school because parents knew that they're going to send their kids to a Christian school 8 hours a day, and for 12 years I have Bible class every single year. That's how I'm going to learn it, and I don't need to plug into youth group, and when I get home I need a break from that. And so Christian schools can kind of replace the church in that sense, which can be dangerous. And I think that caused a lot of kids, at least that I knew, to move away from developing religiously. They wanted to go farther away from it. So the last one is personal factors. The individualization is a huge one I touched on before. The process of becoming separate is called individuation, and the process of developing a stable self-definition is called identity. So both of those things, depending on how we approach religion, affect us in development. So if we say that we want to make religion part of our identity, then we're going to move towards that. If we want to be different than other people, then we can push it away. And those things can also just be conflicting within them. Sometimes our cognitive factors, what we know is right, and what we believe can be different than social factors or personal factors too. So.
I think a big one that would fall under social factors that I think of is like, I have some friends who have fallen away from the faith because of ways that they were like abused or neglected by a father figure growing up. And so, like, how can God, like our Father, obviously he doesn't have a gender. I don't know, that's a whole debate. But anyway, like having a broken father on this earth, like if that is the case, then how can there be this like perfect, loving, all-powerful Father like in heaven? And I think that would fall under social factors of just the way that our backgrounds and our experiences and environment like do shape the way that we see God. And because like our brains are limited and we don't have like even the words to describe a God that is so other and so out of this world, like we use our experiences to kind of describe God, and like even just saying like God is love. Like I have this picture of what love is, but he's like far bigger than anything.
Closing in 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so just like the ways in which people in our lives shape how we see God and how we see faith and religion. Like that's another one that I thought of.
For cognitive factors, something me and Alice talked about in our class is people who can't develop cognitively or have a delay or a disability, like if that inhibits religious development, or if people can still develop religiously without developing cognitively.
It was interesting. We were even talking about like, this is kind of off topic, but like what is an adult? And so many of the people were saying like your ability to have finances or your ability to like think cognitively. And I brought up in class, I was like, then what then are like people who are like cognitively maybe the age of an 8-year-old but actually 35, are they not adults because they don't have this cognitive ability? So it's just interesting in the conversation of that.
And the idea of like social factors, either in parenting or in schooling, it just goes along with everything we've said of like attachment theory and how a child develops, and like their sense of security is so important to the individual they furthermore, like the way they will eventually choose to see God or not because of what they can be confident in.
I would love to know a statistic of like Christians like within a Christian school rather like versus like a public school, and like to see the percentage that like have stayed with the faith. Just because I think that is such a prevalent like discussion of like should you like spend that much money and send your children to Christian school.
Did you go to a Christian school?
I did, yeah. And like that was just something that was always like, you guys are so lucky being here because so like they very much almost like demonized public school
Yeah.
in like a very negative light. And
No, I went to private school. What about you?
Wait, do you go to private?
Private.
Oh, me too.
Public. Private.
yeah,
I think it's interesting because Coffin touched on this, and just like the factors that can be like even faith or religion, specifically Christianity, can kind of be demonized in like the public school systems, where like they're not allowed to pray anymore or anything like that. It's like you actually do see teachers getting actively fired for that and stuff, and just the influence that is, I mean, it's prevalent in both, but it's more tolerated, I think, of like drugs and like promiscuity and like those kind of things in public schools. They're less hush hush. Like they definitely were prevalent in my school. Those things happen, but
We talked about it.
the idea of like what your kid is surrounded by is scary.
Yeah.
And it's like even in private schools they'll have those things, but like it's just another one of those things of like weighing the risk of
Yeah.
there's just so much.
I know, but you also have the risk of like kind of what you were saying, like you get church so much that like, and it's such your parents' belief that it's like it doesn't stick because it doesn't become real because it was never something that like in public school you almost appreciate your faith more because it's like your anchor and it's like your, you know, but when I feel like when you're at Christian school it's just like everyone has this belief and like and then it just becomes something that is like you're numb to it. And I feel like that is a danger. I don't know.
Like apathy, even just like dreading chapel each day or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And like, sorry, but like for me, like our youth group, when we had like a mixture of like some of us like went to like our Christian school that was associated with church, and like others were like public schoolers, and they loved coming to youth group, and they loved being like almost like recharged and being around Christians having discussion. But for all of us, we're like, we don't want to go on Wednesday night. Like we just saw you at school.
Yeah.
We don't really want to go, and like we have Bible class this morning.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And then there's room for hypocrisy because students are being forced to go to those things they don't want to.
Yeah.
So there's still those same problems of drugs and drinking and all those things, but it's hidden and it's not talked about. And you see their behavior and you see their commitment to religion, and those things don't align. And that's even more confusing.
It truly is.
Did we do it?
That's it!
Okay. Thank you. Oh, you have to log in.